Ethan had always been the type to rationalize things. Logic and reason were his guiding principles, even when life seemed to throw the bizarre at him. But as he woke up that morning, rubbing the sleep from his eyes and stretching, his gaze landed on the corner of the room. The figure was still there, unmoving, watching. The logical part of his brain was ready with an excuse. Perhaps it was a shadow caused by the street lamp outside, or a trick of his half-awake mind. But something deep inside him, some primal instinct that had been lying dormant, told him otherwise. The air felt too thick, too charged. Deciding to prove himself wrong, Ethan grabbed his phone and took a picture of the corner. The flash briefly illuminated the room, making his heart pound faster as the contrast threw sharp shadows across his walls. He glanced at the picture, and his breath hitched. There was nothing there, but his eyes, adjusting again to the dim light, still saw it. It didn't make sense. He exhaled, shaking his head, trying to ignore the way his stomach twisted. He needed a test, a way to determine if his sleep-deprived brain was making this up or if something was actually moving. That night, before going to bed, he unrolled a spool of twine, stretching it from his bed to the farthest corner where the figure stood. He tied it securely to his nightstand, marking its position. Then he turned off the lights, telling himself it would still be taut in the morning. Ethan barely slept. Every little sound made his ears perk up. Every creak of the old apartment made his muscles tense. But exhaustion eventually won, and he drifted into a restless sleep. When morning came, he sat up groggily, immediately looking toward the corner. His breath stilled. The figure had moved. Not much, maybe just a few inches, but it was closer. He could tell because the twine he had set as a barrier was slack, no longer pulled tight between the 2 points. The thought sent a cold, nauseating wave through him. He needed another test. That night, he used a tape measure instead, writing down the exact distance between his bed and the shadowy form. His fingers shook slightly as he pressed the numbers onto paper. 6 feet. Again, sleep eluded him. His mind kept playing tricks, making him think he could hear something, making him think he could feel something shifting in the room. He refused to open his eyes. He refused to look. But when he woke up, the first thing he did was check the tape measure. 5 feet. It was getting closer. Ethan's hands felt clammy as he rubbed them over his face. Maybe stress was getting to him. Maybe his mind was unraveling from the loneliness, from the recent breakup, from the lack of sleep. That was it. That had to be it. But as he stared at the number on the measuring tape, he realized something chilling. If it kept moving at this rate, inching forward every night, it would reach his bed in less than a week. Ethan refused to believe it. He tore the tape measure off the floor, rubbing his eyes in frustration. Maybe he had measured wrong the first time. Maybe he was misremembering the original distance. There had to be some rational explanation. But his gut told him otherwise. Panic sat heavy in his chest, but he forced himself to think logically. He needed proof, something undeniable, something he could see with his own eyes. He grabbed his phone and set it up on his dresser, propping it against a book so the camera would capture his entire room overnight. It was a simple plan. If anything moved, if anything shifted, he'd have evidence. And if nothing happened, then maybe he really was losing it. That night he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every muscle in his body tensed. His exhaustion was bone deep, his eyelids heavy, but his nerves kept him from slipping under. He waited for something. Some sign, some sound. But the room was silent. Too silent. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums, that made you hyper-aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat. He wanted to turn over, to look at the corner, but something in his gut screamed at him not to. So he stayed still. Eventually, sleep took him. When morning came, Ethan shot up with a start, heart hammering against his ribs. He had dreamed of something whispering, of cold fingers brushing against his face, of the bed shifting beneath him. But as he looked around, everything seemed normal. Almost. The figure was still there, closer. His pulse pounded in his ears as he reached for his phone, his fingers unsteady as he pulled up the video. His stomach churned as he hit play, watching the dark, grainy footage of himself sleeping. He fast-forwarded through the hours, scanning for movement. Nothing. The room was still, the sheets barely moved, but in the morning the shadow was undeniably closer. His breathing became shallow and an ice-cold realization settled over him. It wasn't moving when he was awake, it was only moving when he slept. He felt like a prisoner in his own home, terrified of what each night would bring. The fear began seeping into his daily life. At work, his hands trembled when he typed emails. He jumped at the sound of his own phone vibrating. Every moment of silence felt like a prelude to something worse, and worst of all, he started seeing it in places it shouldn't be. The first time, it was in his bathroom mirror. He had just finished washing his face, staring at his exhausted reflection when movement in the background made his blood run cold. The figure, standing in the hallway behind him. He spun around so fast he nearly slipped, but the hallway was empty. The second time, it was in the reflection of his television screen. He had been watching some mindless late-night show, trying to distract himself, when the screen cut to black for a commercial break. For a fraction of a second, he saw it. Closer. He yanked the power cord out of the wall. By the time he reached out to his friend Mark, his voice was barely steady. "Dude, I need you to come over." Mark arrived that evening, frowning as he stepped inside. "You look like hell, man." Ethan forced a laugh, but it came out hollow. "Yeah, well, sleep hasn't exactly been my friend lately." Mark flopped onto the couch. "All right, so what's going on?" Ethan hesitated. How was he supposed to explain this without sounding insane? "There's something in my room." Mark's eyebrows shot up. "Like a rat, a ghost, what are we talking about here?" Ethan swallowed hard. "I don't know, but it's getting closer." He pulled out the measuring tape, showing him the notes he had taken each morning. Mark's expression shifted from amusement to concern. "This some kind of prank?" Ethan shook his head. "I wish," Mark sighed. "All right, I'll stay the night. We'll prove that it's nothing and you'll sleep better." "Deal?" Ethan nodded, but dread coiled in his stomach, because deep down he already knew the truth. Tonight it would move again, and this time he wouldn't be the only one to see it. Mark yawned as he set up his sleeping bag on the floor. "All right, Ghostbuster, what's the plan? We stay up and keep watch, or do we just let the spooky thing do its thing?" Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, his nerves frayed. "We set up the cameras again, one on the dresser, one by the door. I want to make sure we get every angle this time." Mark gave him a skeptical look but didn't argue. "Fine, but I swear if this is just some weird sleep paralysis thing, it's not." The certainty in Ethan's voice made Mark pause. After checking the cameras, they settled in. Ethan lay stiff in his bed, staring at the ceiling, while Mark scrolled through his phone, the glow casting strange shadows across his face. An hour passed, then two. Mark's phone eventually slipped from his hands as he drifted off, his quiet snores filling the room. Ethan fought the pull of sleep, but his exhaustion was relentless. His body ached for rest, his eyelids heavy. He forced them open over and over, his heart pounding as the minutes stretched into an eternity. Then something changed. The air in the room shifted, like a pressure drop before a storm. A deep, suffocating stillness took hold. Even Mark's breathing seemed muted. Ethan's eyes flickered to the corner of the room, and there it was, closer. His pulse spiked. It was standing just beyond the glow of the nightlight, its shape darker than the shadows around it. The figure had never been this close before. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat. He wanted to move, to scream at Mark, to do something, but his body refused to obey. Then movement, not from the figure, from the bed. The sheets pulled taut as if something unseen had pressed against them. Ethan's stomach clenched in terror. His mind screamed, but his body remained frozen. And then, Mark's phone buzzed. The sound shattered the silence like a gunshot. The figure vanished. The weight on the bed lifted. Ethan gasped, his body jerking upright. Mark stirred, rubbing his face groggily. "Huh? What's—" Ethan bolted for the camera. He grabbed the device, shaking hands, fumbling as he rewound the footage. Mark sat up, confused. "Dude, what the hell? What's wrong?" Ethan didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the screen. The footage played in grainy, low-light detail. At first, nothing. Then, at exactly 3:35 a.m., the figure shifted. It moved, a single step forward, then another and another. Each step was impossibly slow, deliberate, as if it was savoring the approach. Then, just before Mark's phone buzzed, it stopped at the foot of the bed. Its head tilted, watching. Then, Ethan stopped the playback. A whisper, barely audible, a single word. Almost. His stomach dropped. His vision swam. Mark leaned closer, frowning at the screen. Is that me? Am I sleep-talking or no? Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper. Then who the hell? Ethan slowly turned to look at Mark. Mark turned to look at Ethan. They both turned to look at the bed. The air in the room felt wrong again, and on the crumpled sheets directly between them, a deep indentation, like someone was lying there, watching, waiting. Neither of them slept that night. By morning, Mark had packed his things. "Dude," he said, voice strained, "you need to leave. I don't care what the lease says. Get out." Ethan nodded, but deep down he knew it wouldn't matter, because it was too late. He wasn't the one who had moved closer. It was. And it was almost here. Ethan sat on the floor of his bedroom, his back against the cold wooden frame of his bed. The morning light streamed in through the blinds, but it did little to banish the oppressive weight in the room. Mark was gone. He had left without another word, his pale face drawn tight with fear. Ethan could still hear his last words. "You need to leave. I don't care what the lease says. Get out." But Ethan knew it wouldn't matter. He wasn't the one who had moved closer. It was. His mind felt like a frayed wire, buzzing with exhaustion and terror. He hadn't slept. He couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the footage over and over, listening to that whisper. Almost. He tried to rationalize it, to tell himself it was some kind of mistake, a glitch in the camera, an audio anomaly. But the imprint on the bed, the weight he had felt, those weren't glitches. Those were real. A new plan formed in his mind. He needed proof. Proof that he wasn't going insane. Proof that would show someone, anyone, that something unnatural was happening in his room. He spent the rest of the day meticulously setting up a new monitoring system. He placed his phone on the nightstand, its camera pointed directly at his bed. A second camera, borrowed from Mark before he bolted, was placed at the foot of the bed, capturing the room from a different angle. He even set up an old laptop to record a continuous stream. As an extra precaution, he lined the floor with salt, a half-remembered superstition he had read about somewhere. He wasn't religious, but at this point he was willing to try anything. By nightfall, his body screamed for sleep, but his mind resisted. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the empty room. Waiting. Watching. The clock ticked past 3 a.m., and then the air shifted. The same suffocating stillness settled over the room. The same drop in temperature. The same primal dread slithered into his veins. Ethan didn't move. The cameras were rolling. His breath came shallow, his heart hammering against his ribs. He clenched his fists against the blankets, willing himself to stay awake. The seconds stretched into eternity, and then he saw it. The figure was closer. It stood at the foot of his bed now, just beyond the salt line. His stomach clenched. The dim glow of the nightlight cast strange, elongated shadows across its shape, but no details, no face, no features, just darkness. Ethan forced himself to look at the cameras. The phone's screen showed the room exactly as it was, except the figure wasn't there. His stomach churned. He turned to the laptop feed. Same thing. The room, his bed, himself, but nothing else. It was like the cameras refused to see it. A wave of nausea rolled through him. His grip tightened on the sheets. And then, it moved. It didn't walk, didn't shift, didn't even seem to bend like a normal body should. One moment, it was at the foot of his bed. The next, it was beside him. Right. There. Ethan's body locked up in pure animal terror. His breath stilled in his throat, his vision swimming as his mind screamed to run. But he couldn't move, couldn't blink. The figure loomed over him, its shape blacker than the darkness itself. And then, slowly, so slowly, it bent toward him. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut. Something touched his forehead, cold, wet. Wrong. His breath hitched in his throat. A voice, barely more than a vibration against his skull, whispered one word, almost. And then, everything went dark. When he woke up, it was morning. The cameras were off, the laptop battery was dead, and the salt line scattered, like something had walked right through it. Ethan's hands shook as he checked the footage, his stomach twisting into knots. The files were there, the recordings had saved, but as he played them back, his stomach turned to ice. The entire night's recording was just static, except for one frame, a single still image of his bed, with him asleep in it. And directly above him, a shadowy figure pressed against him, its featureless face inches from his own, its hands gripping his shoulders, and its mouth right against his ear. The file ended, Ethan's body locked up in pure horror. His breath came in ragged gasps, his pulse thundering in his ears. It wasn't just watching him, it wasn't just getting closer. It had been there the whole time. He wasn't running from it, he was already inside of it. Ethan didn't remember packing. One moment he was staring at the screen, his mind struggling to grasp the impossible. The next, he was stuffing clothes into a duffel bag, his hands moving on their own, driven by something primal. He had to leave. The apartment didn't feel like his anymore. The walls seemed too close, pressing inward. The air was thick, stale, suffocating. Every shadow felt wrong, stretching in ways they shouldn't. He didn't care about the lease, didn't care about losing his deposit. He just needed to be gone. His breath hitched as he glanced one last time at the bed. The sheets were still rumpled, the outline of his body faintly visible. But that wasn't what made his stomach twist into knots. It was the indentation beside it, the unmistakable weight of something else that had lain there. Watching, waiting, breathing. He grabbed his bag and bolted for the door. The knob was ice cold beneath his fingers, but he didn't hesitate. He yanked it open, stepping out into the hallway with a shuddering breath. The air out here was different. Lighter, but something was wrong. The hallway felt still. Too still. The fluorescent lights above flickered. Somewhere down the corridor, a door creaked open. Ethan didn't look. He wouldn't look. He forced himself forward, his pulse hammering in his ears. Don't look back. Don't look back. Don't. A whisper, right behind him. So close it sent a shiver down his spine. Almost. Ethan ran. He didn't stop until he was in his car, hands trembling as he jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. He didn't breathe until he was several blocks away. Even then, he kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see something sitting in his back seat. But he was alone. For now. The motel room smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap air freshener, but Ethan didn't care. He double-checked the locks, pulled the curtains shut, turned on every light. Sleep wouldn't come easily. He knew that now, but exhaustion had a way of creeping in, and eventually his body gave in. The motel bed was stiff, unfamiliar, but it was safe, safer than home. For the first time in days, he slept without waking to a shadow looming over him. No whispers, no movements, just silence. And when he woke up, for a fleeting moment, he almost believed it was over. Almost. Then his phone buzzed. A message from his landlord. New tenant moved in. Thanks for leaving the place in great condition. Ethan sat up, a lump forming in his throat. His fingers hovered over the screen before he forced himself to type a response. Have they noticed anything strange? A few moments passed. Then the reply came. No, but he did say something weird. Said he feels like someone's watching him sleep. Ethan's hands shook, his stomach twisted into ice. He turned off his phone, threw it across the room. The cycle had started again, and he had escaped. For now, but somewhere in a darkened bedroom, someone else would be waking up, feeling that same unease, noticing that same shape, standing a little closer than it had been the night before, watching, waiting, whispering. Almost.